Under Queen Elizabeth I, hundreds were burned, hanged, or gutted just for staying Catholic. She's remembered as the Virgin Queen, the golden icon of England's glory. But behind the crown was a throne built on corpses, fear, and silence. This wasn't just politics. It was a campaign of destruction, carried out by law, fueled by paranoia, and justified as nation-building. It begins not with a coronation nor a golden age, but with a body, limp, burned, or broken, tied to a stake or hanging from a rope, watched by a crowd that knew better than to cream. Because in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, death was not just a punishment. It was a message, delivered publicly, theatrically, and without apology. She would later be called the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the mother of a strong and Protestant England. But those names came long after the executions, after the prisons were full, after the fires were lit in silence and the bodies were buried without headstones. Behind the painted face, behind the pearls and red wigs and carefully constructed images of divine rule, Elizabeth Tudor carried a childhood lined with fear, betrayal, and the sound of iron doors locking behind people she loved. Her mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed by her father, Henry VIII, when Elizabeth was barely 3 years old. One day her mother was queen, the next she was a whore and a traitor, beheaded in the Tower while Elizabeth's status dropped from princess to bastard in a single stroke of royal pen and steel blade. Elizabeth grew up in a world where survival meant silence, where loyalty could kill you, and where religion was no longer a matter of private belief but a litmus test of obedience. She watched half-siblings ascend and die, Edward VI, a Protestant boy king who died young, Mary Farrer, a Catholic queen who ruled in blood and burned Protestants alive in the same tower her mother had died in. By the time Elizabeth reached the throne in 1558, she had seen what power cost, and she knew that in order to keep it, she could not afford softness, could not allow dissent, and could not trust even her own heartbeat if it beat too slowly in the night. She came to power after the death of her half-sister Mary, whose reign was marked by executions, exiles, and the burning of hundreds of Protestants. But unlike Mary, Elizabeth knew how to wield cruelty without appearing cruel. Where Mary had martyrs, Elizabeth would have obedience, and so she cloaked herself in purity, draping the court in myths of virginity and destiny, calling herself married to her people, and surrounding herself with paintings, poems, and pageants that proclaimed her sacred and untouchable. But beneath that imagery lay a bitter calculation, that religion was not merely spiritual but political, and that Catholics, once the majority, were now a threat to be managed, watched, and if necessary, erased. She had learned from her father the value of pageantry and performance. She had learned from her sister the dangers of being too open with fire. So Elizabeth lit her fires slowly, legally, and often out of sight. In her earliest proclamations, she promised tolerance, moderation, and peace, but those words began to rot almost as soon as they were written, eaten away by paranoia, foreign threats, and the whispers of rebellion. She feared Spain. She feared the Pope. She feared Mary, Queen of Scots. But above all, she feared losing her crown. And she knew that fear is the most efficient form of governance. The Act of Supremacy in 1559 made Elizabeth the supreme governor of the Church of England, and the Act of Uniformity made it illegal to attend any religious service outside of that church. It seemed harmless on the surface, just laws to maintain order, but in practice they created a system of persecution where simply hearing a Catholic Mass could get you fined, imprisoned, or worse. In private, Elizabeth was more cautious. Even conflicted, she didn't enjoy torture, and she sometimes delayed executions, but she also never stopped them. She signed the warrants, she allowed the interrogations, she built the structure and let others carry it out. Her inner circle, Cecil, Walsingham, and other men who saw her fears as fuel, began crafting a regime of surveillance and suspicion, using spies, informants, and coded letters to hunt down those who still clung to the old faith. Priests were arrested for saying Mass. Families were punished for sheltering them. Some were killed in secret, others were dragged through the streets to be torn open while still breathing. And as the years passed, the mask of the Virgin Queen grew heavier, more ornate, more radiant, while behind it the machinery of death turned without pause. Portraits showed her glowing with divine authority, hair bright as fire, eyes unblinking, and pure. But the real Elizabeth was aging, anxious, and increasingly isolated, haunted by plots both real and imagined. She covered her scars with makeup. She avoided mirrors. She banned all images that showed her as she truly was, and yet the mask worked. To much of the world, she was glorious. The Virgin Queen who saved England from chaos, the woman who stood alone and ruled like a god. But to Catholics hiding in their cellars, to priests buried in shallow graves, to children forced to renounce their faith under threat of violence, she was something else entirely. Not a queen, not a saviour, but a storm in pearls and velvet, a monarch who learned early that fear lasts longer than love, and used that lesson to its fullest. The year was 1559, barely months after Elizabeth I claimed the throne, when her parliament passed two laws that would shape the fate of thousands, not just during her lifetime, but for generations after. The Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity. Innocuous names for policies that turned private belief into public crime, that transformed Catholicism from a faith into a felony, and that laid the groundwork for a slow, systematic, state-sanctioned cleansing of everything that smelled like Rome. The laws were clear in their cold logic. The Queen, not the Pope, was now the supreme head of the Church in England, and every subject, no matter how devout or how silent, was required to attend Anglican services and swear loyalty to the new order, or face the consequences. Missing church once or twice brought fines, missing it regularly brought suspicion, speaking out brought prison, and refusing to renounce the Pope, that was now treason, a crime punishable by death, drawn, hanged, quartered, and displayed for the public to see. Elizabeth's court, elegant on the surface and dressed in the language of renewal, was quietly sharpening its blades behind the curtain, because the Queen had learned early that peace is only as strong as the fear that holds it in place, and that fear, once embedded in law, could do more than armies ever could. It began with pressure, subtle and relentless. Parish notices warning against foreign rites, children at grammar schools taught to denounce the old ways, sermons that painted Catholics as conspirators and agents of Spain, and whispers in market stalls where neighbours began asking too many questions about who had attended which church and who had stayed home. But it did not stay subtle for long. Soon came the closures. Abbeys and chapels that had survived the upheaval of Henry VIII were shuttered once more, their altars smashed, their statues torn down, their relics burned in bonfires meant to purify the kingdom. Priests who refused to conform were stripped of their positions. Monks were exiled or imprisoned. Sacraments once considered sacred, the Eucharist, confession, the sign of the cross, became incriminating evidence in a court of law. The homes of recusants, those who refused to attend Anglican services, were raided without warning. People were fined into poverty, publicly humiliated, and forced to choose between belief and survival. A missed mass could cost you a month's wages. Sheltering a priest could cost you your life, and the laws grew more brutal as the years went on, each act more draconian than the last, each regulation written not in ink, but in fear. By 1581, the penalty for saying Mass was 200, the equivalent of a small fortune, and imprisonment. By 1585, harbouring a Catholic priest was officially classified as treason, and treason meant torture, execution, and your name wiped from the record before your body had even turned cold. Elizabeth did not appear in court to condemn these people. She rarely watched their deaths. She did not hold the branding iron or the rope, but she did not stop them either. She signed the laws. She allowed the escalation. And she let her advisers, particularly Francis Walsingham, the spymaster whose networks of informants stretched like veins across the kingdom, turn England into a machine that consumed faith and spit out corpses. Catholicism, once the soul of the nation, was now reframed as foreign, dangerous, and fundamentally disloyal. Its followers painted as enemies not just of the crown, but of the people, the state, and the divine order of England itself. And in a world where loyalty to the monarch was seen as loyalty to God, this recasting of religious practice into political subversion and made every prayer whispered in Latin a potential death sentence. The method was slow, legalistic, and always wrapped in the rhetoric of justice. This was not a purge, they said. It was the maintenance of peace, not vengeance, but order, not hatred, but security. But for those who lived it, the mothers who lost sons, the husbands who watched their wives imprisoned, the children taught to fear their own grandparents' crucifixes, it felt like war without a name, and it was not limited to the priests or the outspoken. It spread like rot through the countryside and into the cities, turning homes into battlegrounds of murmurs, where people stopped inviting neighbours over, where whispers became weapons, and where even the smallest gesture, making the sign of the cross, lighting a candle, holding rosary beads, could bring a knock at the door that never ended well. Executions became public spectacles, designed not only to punish but to instruct, to terrify, to remind. They were held in market squares, outside cathedrals, along the banks of the Thames. And when the bodies were quartered, limbs nailed to city gates, entrails burned in fire, it was not just to kill a person, but to erase their faith from the streets, from the soil, from memory itself. And still they came, still people prayed in secret, still mass was whispered in candlelit basements, still families risked everything to keep their faith alive, not for rebellion, not for Spain, not even for Rome, but for the love of a god who no longer had legal status in their homeland. What began as a legal effort to enforce unity became with terrifying speed a program of spiritual extermination, methodical, relentless, and cloaked in the soft language of loyalty. Elizabeth did not build bonfires like her sister Mary. She did not unleash mobs or shout vengeance in the streets. She let the law do the killing. She let silence and fines and slow legal nooses replace the old chaos of riot and revolt. And by doing so, she made cruelty look like order. She made violence look like law. And she made a campaign of religious annihilation look like the golden age of English peace. But if peace is built on bones, is it peace at all? The hunt did not begin with soldiers in armour or swords drawn at the gates, but with shadows, thin men in black cloaks, carrying warrants and whispers, trained not in warfare, but in silence, suspicion, and the slow art of watching a man until he no longer felt like one. They were called priest hunters, official agents of the crown, appointed and funded by the state to seek out those who dared keep the old faith alive behind closed doors, in locked attics, or within the breath of a whispered Latin prayer. Their mission was not one of discovery, it was one of extermination, to find, to expose, to capture, and, if needed, to break. These were not isolated agents, acting on rumours or rogue fury. They worked from lists. They studied names. They received tips from neighbours, from tavern keepers, from children coerced into repeating what their parents muttered at night. The registers, kept in secret offices, in the hands of Walsingham and his network of state informants, grew longer each month, a bloodless catalogue of souls marked for destruction. Names, addresses, suspicions, sightings, interrogations, confessions. These were not ordinary men they hunted, but neither were they soldiers. They were Jesuits, seminarians, missionaries smuggled in from France, Italy, and the Spanish Netherlands, men ordained in secrecy and sent back into England with false names, forged papers, and the knowledge that discovery meant death. They travelled at night, disguised as tutors or musicians or merchants. They baptized children, blessed marriages, gave last rites to the dying, each act illegal, each word of Latin a nail in their own coffin. To the Queen's government, they were not men of God but spies, agents of a foreign power, traitors disguised in robes, and thus their lives were forfeit the moment they stepped onto English soil. And so the priest-hunters came. They raided homes. They scoured the countryside. They turned over floorboards, knocked down walls, stabbed into hay bales, and tore apart libraries in search of priest holes, those hidden compartments carved into chimneys, under stairs, behind altar panels, each a temporary tomb designed to buy hours of life for a hunted man. Some priests stayed hidden for days, without food, light, or air, listening to soldiers stomp overhead, while families prayed not for salvation, but for silence. And yet many were found, dragged into the street, paraded before townspeople, interrogated in public squares, and tortured behind stone doors that did not echo beyond the tower. The cases were many. The cruelty was consistent. Edmund Campion, a Jesuit scholar, brilliant in mind and magnetic in spirit, returned to England in 1580 to minister in secret. He was captured within months, dragged through London in chains, stretched on the rack until his joints snapped, and forced to debate his captors while broken in body. He never renounced his faith. He was executed on December 1st, 1581, hanged, drawn and quartered. His head was mounted on London Bridge. His entrails burned before a silent crowd. Margaret Clitheroe, a butcher's wife in York, mother of 3, arrested for harbouring priests and refusing to plead, because pleading would require her to testify and thus condemn others. For her silence, she was stripped, placed between a door and heavy stones, and slowly crushed to death over the course of 15 minutes. She died praying for the Queen who had ordered her death, The executions were not hidden. They were staged, announced in advance, crowd summoned, banners raised, drummers marching. It was not justice. It was theatre. The kind that made examples, that silenced communities, that reminded the people what happened to those who put God above the crown. And as more priests were captured, tortured, and executed, the registers thickened with names, not only of clergy but of those who helped them, landlords, maids, young boys who served as messengers, and elderly women who gave a cup of water or stitched a robe. Some of these people were killed. Others were imprisoned for years. Still others were financially ruined, forced to pay crushing fines, to surrender lands, to watch their families unravel under the weight of loyalty. And all of them disappeared from history the same way they had lived in it, quietly, without memorial, without headstone, without the dignity of public grief. The priest hunters kept going. They were given more resources. They were celebrated in court. Some were knighted. And behind each execution was the cold logic of Elizabeth's regime, that religion was now a political tool, and that those who defied the Queen's supremacy were not heretics, but enemies of the state. It was no longer about belief, it was about obedience. And when obedience fails, the body must become the warning. Children saw the heads on spikes, women saw entrails burned in iron baskets, men saw friends disappear and never return, and all of it, every rope, every rack, every ruined name was written in ledgers, signed by magistrates, archived by secretaries. England, the land of poetry and pageantry, had become a kingdom of registries and executions, where the line between worship and war had dissolved entirely. The death toll was not in the tens, it was not even in the hundreds. By the end of Elizabeth's reign, nearly 1,000 people had died because of their faith, many of them priests, many more just ordinary souls who had dared to believe something the law now called treason. And still, Elizabeth's mask remained intact. Still the paintings glowed. Still the court wrote poems about her virginity and strength and divine right. But behind closed doors, beneath the gilded ceilings, in the spaces between applause and silence, there were lists, long, ink-stained lists, of names now erased from their own lives, buried without markers, mourned only by those too afraid to speak. They were not just hunted, they were erased. And erasure, as Elizabeth knew too well, lasts longer than death. In Elizabethan England, torture was not a whispered practice nor a dirty secret. It was a ritual, a performance, a carefully choreographed descent into agony designed not only to extract confession, but to destroy identity, to strip the soul of its dignity, and to do so beneath the seal of law and the flicker of torchlight, as if suffering itself were a necessary currency for keeping the kingdom safe. It was not used recklessly but deliberately, reserved not for every criminal, but for those deemed most dangerous: recusants, missionary priests, suspected agents of Rome, and anyone whose silence under questioning was interpreted not as fear or faith, but as treason in disguise. Because in this New England, to remain silent was to challenge the crown, and to believe in another authority, spiritual or foreign, was to commit an act of rebellion that had to be broken, publicly and irrevocably. And so the Tower of London, once a fortress of kings, became something darker, a legal abyss where men were brought in secret, chained in stone cells, denied daylight for weeks, and prepared, methodically, efficiently, for what the Crown called necessary examination. The most feared device in this theatre of pain was the rack, a wooden frame fitted with turning wheels, ropes, and a promise. The victim would be laid flat, limbs tied at each corner, and then, slowly with precision, the wheels would turn, stretching the body beyond its limits until tendons tore, shoulders separated, and the joints exploded from within like wood snapping under fire. And when that agony failed to bring words, the process would be paused, only to begin again the next day, as if pain was a language that just needed more time to be understood. But the rack was only the beginning. There were thumb screws, designed to crush bones in the fingers until they bled from beneath the nail. There were scavengers' daughters, iron frames that folded the victim into themselves until their own ribcage cracked. There were hot irons, pressed not for confession but to test resolve, and blades heated red, used to carve skin, brand symbols, or sever tongues that refused to speak the Queen's truth. Men were blinded, women were disfigured, children were threatened in front of their mothers, their fathers, their priests, and all of it, every scream, every confession, and every death, was recorded in cold, measured ink by scribes who claimed they were protecting the realm from the chaos of Rome. These were not medieval brutes in shadowy dungeons. These were educated men, lawyers, nobles, councillors, who spoke in Latin, who quoted scripture, and who believed that suffering in the name of state security was not cruelty, but duty. They did not think themselves monsters. They thought themselves surgeons, cutting out the rot of rebellion before it could spread. The logic was airtight. If the victim confessed, the torture had worked. If they refused, the torture was justified. And if they died, well, better one dead than a nation divided. Confessions, once extracted, were paraded before judges, broadcast in town squares, and used to condemn not just the speaker, but their friends, families, entire parishes. And if someone retracted their confession later, after the pain had passed, after the body stopped bleeding, it didn't matter. The record was already written. The sentence was already passed. The executioner was already sharpening his blade. Some never made it to trial. Some were tortured so brutally that they were simply disposed of, dumped in ditches or buried beneath prison floors, their names erased, their bodies listed as died during questioning, as if truth could ever be born from screams. And what of the Queen? Elizabeth I, the monarch painted as wisdom incarnate, did not wield the knife herself, but she signed the orders, she read the reports, she knew the names. She was briefed in council meetings about which priest had broken, which noblewoman had finally given up her household chaplain, which boy had revealed the names of the underground mass-goers, and she gave her quiet assent, always phrased in the language of necessity. Her court defended these tortures with phrases like, "for the good of the realm," "security of Her Majesty," or "protection against foreign plots," and always the refrain that no good subject need ever fear such methods, because only the guilty, only the disloyal, only the enemies of England's sacred peace would ever find themselves on the rack. But the truth, twisted like the bodies it tormented, was simpler. Belief alone was enough. A prayer whispered to the wrong God, a crucifix hidden behind a wall, a refusal to take Anglican communion. That was enough. And when the torture was over and the execution carried out, be it by hanging, drawing, quartering, or burning, what remained was not justice but a vacuum. Families shattered, communities terrified, and silence stretching across the kingdom like a fog no wind could lift. But still the machine turned. Because Elizabeth's England was not just a monarchy, it was a system, a meticulously constructed hierarchy of fear, law, and fire that rewarded obedience and punished even the hint of conscience. And in that system, pain became performance, a sacred rite designed to remind every subject that loyalty was not a feeling, it was a function of the flesh. Even today, centuries later, when we walk the stones of the tower, when we look at the cells where light never entered, when we read the letters scratched by dying hands onto cell walls or hidden beneath floorboards, we are left not just with horror, but with a question. How far can a nation go to preserve itself before it becomes the very thing it claims to fear? And more haunting still, if no one stood trial for these tortures, if the laws permitted them, and if the Queen herself endorsed them, were they crimes at all? If fear is a flame, then by the late 1580s, it had become an inferno, a slow-burning terror that consumed not only priests and recusants, but the very idea of trust, dissolving the boundary between political caution and mass paranoia, until England under Elizabeth I stood not as a bastion of order, but as a nation shadowed by suspicion, fueled by rumours, and governed by the principle that it was better to execute 10 innocents than to let one traitor live. The spark was real. The Spanish Armada, that looming threat across the Channel, had evolved from diplomatic chess into something far more visceral, a fleet of ships bristling with cannons and Catholic banners, sent not only to conquer but to restore, to return England to the arms of Rome and dethrone the heretic queen who had defied the Pope and slain her Catholic cousin Mary of Scots. In 1588 it came, massive, terrifying, divine in the eyes of its commanders, and though it failed to breach the English coast, its shadow lingered far longer than its sails, embedding itself deep in the Queen's council chambers and even deeper in her bloodstream. Elizabeth survived the Armada, but the price was not paid by Spain, it was paid by her own people. For in the wake of invasion, foiled or not, every loyal Catholic was now viewed not as a citizen, but as a potential spy, a sleeper agent, a sword waiting to be unsheathed by foreign command. and if the enemy could not land on English soil with ships and soldiers, then surely it would arrive through the hearts of its secret worshippers. So the logic became ironclad. Every recusant was a threat, every priest was a conspirator, every Latin prayer was a coded message to Madrid. And from that fear, mass executions flowed, not wild or chaotic, but orderly, justified, and sealed with the Queen's seal, because treason, once declared, needed no further proof in the age of the Armada. In the months following 1588, dozens of people, many of them ordinary, some devout, others merely accused, were rounded up, interrogated, tortured and sentenced to death under the charge of aiding Spain, of harbouring treasonous thoughts, of whispering loyalty to the wrong monarch. The executions came in waves, 1588, 1589, and 1590, years stained with blood and bureaucracy, as gallows were erected in towns that had once known only festivals, and courthouses filled with cases that cited nothing but association, nothing but proximity to someone who had once refused the Anglican Mass. Entire families were broken apart by nothing more than a glance, a conversation overheard, a neighbour's suspicion, one wrong word in a tavern, one absence from church, one Latin book found in a bedroom drawer. Elizabeth's advisers, particularly Walsingham, the spymaster whose fingerprints were on every arrest and every interrogation, insisted this was defence, not oppression. But defence, in this new regime, had become indistinguishable from punishment, and punishment no longer required intent, only proximity. In Lancashire, a widow was hanged for sending money to her exiled brother, a seminary student in Douai. In Norwich, a teenage boy was executed for delivering letters written in Latin, though he could not read the language. In York, a priest found hiding in a hayloft was dragged through the streets by a mob of Crown-loyal citizens, then executed without trial, his only crime, saying Mass for the dying. And in London, 40 men were executed in a single week, their bodies dismembered and displayed across the city, each one a warning carved into flesh, each one a reminder that the Queen's mercy was as thin as parchment. But what made these executions even more terrifying was not just their number, but the way they rewired society itself, turning citizens into informants, families into strangers, and the act of staying silent into a kind of resistance punishable by blood. The government encouraged it. Pamphlets were printed describing the deaths in graphic detail, meant to glorify loyalty and scare away dissent. Schoolchildren were made to memorize the stories of traitors. Clergy were ordered to preach sermons praising the Queen's justice while warning that Spain would surely rise again if the recusants were not rooted out like weeds. Elizabeth, ever the master of image, stayed carefully distant from the carnage. She did not appear at executions, she rarely commented on the deaths, but she read the intelligence reports. She received the warrants, she knew the names, and more importantly, she knew the effect, that by letting the law kill loudly, she could rule quietly. No need for proclamations, no need for martial law, only the constant ambient fear that one misstep, one mass, one letter could end with rope and fire. Even within the court, nobles began to whisper, to watch their words. Some burned old Catholic books in secret. Others rebaptized their children in the Anglican rite to avoid suspicion. Still others fled into exile, into silence, into the long corridors of anonymous survival that have left so many stories lost forever. Yet not all were silent. Some wrote letters before death, declaring loyalty to both Crown and Church. Some sang hymns on the scaffold. Some forgave their executioners, even as the crowd jeered and the headsman tightened the rope. And in doing so they carved a different legacy, one that no law, no rack, no queen could fully erase. But the damage had already been done. By the time the fires dimmed and the gallows were taken down, England had been reshaped, not just by the death of Spaniards at sea, but by the death of its own people on land. The nation that Elizabeth built on resistance to Rome had become something darker, a machine of internal purge, a system of surveillance, where loyalty was measured not in love, but in distance from the condemned. And as the Queen aged, as her face cracked beneath layers of white powder, as her robes grew heavier and her smile thinner, the fear remained, not of Spain, not of God, but of her own subjects, who might still harbour a prayer, a name, or a silence that could burn the whole illusion down, because in the end the Spanish Armada did not destroy England, but it licensed England to destroy itself, one execution at a time. If there was one woman in Europe who haunted Elizabeth's dreams, not with swords or soldiers, but with bloodline and birthright, It was Mary Stuart, Queen of the Scots, the Catholic cousin whose very existence was a threat, whose presence in English prisons was a paradox, and whose death would mark one of the darkest thresholds in Elizabeth's long reign. Mary was not merely another rival, she was the granddaughter of Margaret Tudor, and therefore, by the logic of hereditary succession, the next in line to the English throne should Elizabeth die without an heir. She was also, more dangerously, a devout Catholic, beloved by Rome, supported by France, admired by Spain, and idolised by thousands of English subjects who still saw Elizabeth as illegitimate. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, a king's whore who had stolen a crown by divorce and execution. To the Protestant crown, Mary was a problem. To the Catholic underground, she was a symbol. And to Elizabeth, she was both, a living embodiment of everything the Virgin Queen feared: religious rebellion, dynastic instability, and the image of another woman wearing her crown. For nearly 19 years, Mary was kept under house arrest in England, moved from castle to castle, guarded by noblemen isolated from allies, and used as both bargaining chip and bait, while Elizabeth's counsellors debated whether keeping her alive was safer than killing her. And all the while, plots rose and fell, real and imagined, conspiracies that tied Mary to rebellions, to assassins, to invasions launched in her name. The Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, and finally the Babington plot, each one a noose tightening around a woman who by then had already lost her crown, her freedom, her child, and nearly every ounce of political power she once held. But power, as Elizabeth well knew, was not always about armies or laws. It was about perception, and as long as Mary Stuart breathed, the perception remained that Elizabeth was replaceable, that England could have a Catholic queen again, one with royal blood, divine right, and papal blessing. So when the Babington plot emerged in 1586, allegedly linking Mary to a plan to assassinate Elizabeth, the machinery of fear and paperwork moved swiftly. Mary was tried, Mary was convicted, and Elizabeth was left with the decision that had haunted her for nearly 2 decades. To execute her crowned queen, a woman anointed by God not for what she had done, but for what she might inspire. It was in every sense unprecedented. To kill a monarch was to unravel the divine order, to tear the veil of sacred rule and expose the throne as vulnerable, conditional, mortal. To kill a monarch was to authorize rebellion everywhere, for if a queen could be executed by another, then what stopped any subject anywhere from drawing the same conclusion? Elizabeth agonized over the decision. She signed the death warrant, then she unsigned it, then she blamed her ministers, then she wept, but the warrant moved forward. On the morning of February 8th, 1587, at Fotheringhay Castle, Mary Queen of Scots walked into a cold hall lit by grey English light, dressed in scarlet silk, the colour of martyrdom in Catholic tradition, carrying a small wooden crucifix and the weight of history on her shoulders. She knelt. She forgave her executioners. She declared herself innocent, not of politics but of faith, and prayed for the soul of her cousin, the woman who had sentenced her to die. The execution was brutal. The first blow missed, striking the back of her head. The second blow severed her neck, and the third, used to cut the last flesh, revealed that even her body had been searched for secrets. Beneath her petticoat, they found a small dog, hidden and shaking, drenched in the blood of its mistress. The news shocked Europe. Catholic nations erupted in horror. The Pope declared Mary a martyr. Spain, already poised for war, accelerated preparations for the Armada. And Elizabeth denied responsibility. She claimed her counsellors had acted without her consent. She refused to meet the messenger who brought her the news. She retreated into mourning and refused to speak of Mary's name again, but no amount of denial could erase what had happened. A queen had killed a queen. A woman, isolated for years, had been turned into a corpse, not for raising an army, not for waging war, but for simply existing as an alternate future. The death of Mary Stuart was not just a crime, it was a political exorcism, an erasure of opposition so final, so irreversible, that even Elizabeth's most loyal subjects whispered about it with unease. Because if the crown could kill one of its own, what protection did any subject have? What divine order could be trusted? In that moment, Elizabeth crossed a line she could never return from. She had held off war, quelled rebellion, and shaped a nation through manipulation and myth. But by spilling royal blood, blood of her own kin, blood that traced back to the same Tudor roots, she revealed something deeper. That her rule was no longer merely pragmatic but paranoid, no longer reactive but predatory. And though her throne remained steady, her image began to crack, not in public, not in her portraits, but in the private minds of those who watched her grow older, more silent, more surrounded by echoes of those she had outlived. Mary's body was buried in Peterborough, far from Scotland, far from Rome, far from the streets where her name was still whispered in prayer. But her ghost remained, not in the halls of England, but in the memory of what it meant to challenge power, to live long enough to threaten, and to die not because of action, but because of presence. And Elizabeth, the Queen of England, the light of the Protestant world, the Gloriana of poets, would carry that ghost with her until the end, not as a memory of victory, but as a stain no coronation could bleach, because no matter how many laws she passed, no matter how many images were painted, no matter how many enemies were silenced, there would always be that moment, that blade, that dog shaking in blood at its mistress's feet, and the sound of history turning against itself. It's one thing to kill a man, it's another thing entirely to erase him, to unwrite his name, to distort his legacy, to turn his belief into betrayal, and to bury not just his body, but the memory of who he was beneath a layer of state-sanctioned narrative so thick, so calculated, that even those who watched him die might begin to doubt what they saw, and that, more than executions, more than torture, more than laws written in the ink of fear, became one of Elizabeth I's most enduring weapons, the deliberate rewriting of memory, the transformation of victims into villains, the control not just of actions but of meaning itself. Because Elizabeth's reign was not only about suppressing Catholicism, it was about redefining it, about ensuring that future generations would not remember the priests as holy men, or the women as loyal wives, or the children as faithful sons, but instead as radicals, as enemies, as conspirators plotting with foreign kings to plunge England into chaos. And to achieve that, the crown didn't just burn bodies, it burned books. It sent agents into towns and monasteries with orders to confiscate, censor and destroy any materials that praised the old religion or recorded the lives of those who had died for it. Biographies of martyred priests were outlawed. Prayer books from the continent were seized and burned. Letters written by those executed, testimonies from the scaffold, final words of faith, were confiscated or reworded until they served the crown's version of events. Printing presses were placed under tight royal control. All texts required licensing, all sermons required approval, and any unauthorized attempt to circulate Catholic literature, even the most benign, was treated as sedition. The state even controlled school books, revising the curriculum to teach young children that loyalty to the Queen meant rejecting the old faith, that Catholics were rebels, and that those who died on the scaffold had not been faithful, they had been traitors. It wasn't just repression, it was reprogramming, and it reached everywhere. In churches, stained glass windows depicting saints were replaced with images of the Queen. In grammar schools, Latin was discouraged, not because of language, but because it smelled too much of Rome. Children who once knelt before crucifixes now bowed before portraits of Elizabeth. And in every village the message was the same: your memory is not your own, it belongs to the crown and it will be shaped into obedience. But even that wasn't enough, because as stories are resilient, they cling to the underside of history. And so the Queen's ministers launched a broader campaign, not just to erase the martyrs, but to replace them. They created new saints, not religious ones, but political ones. Elizabeth herself became the saint of the state. She was England's Deborah, the light of Israel, the second Judith. Figures drawn from scripture, repurposed to make her divine. Poets called her Gloriana, Astraea, Fairy Queen. Painters depicted her with sunbursts behind her head, or with serpents crushed underfoot, as if she were not just monarch, but Messiah. And in that transformation, the real bodies disappeared. The crushed ribs of Margaret Clitheroe, the stretched limbs of Edmund Campion, the faces of widows who died unnamed in tower cells. All of them were quietly removed from the English conscience, not by force but by forgetting. And yet, beneath the surface, their stories refused to die. In some villages, families whispered their names after nightfall. In hidden chapels, priests passed down their relics: a piece of cloth, a rosary bead, a fingernail from a man who had bled for his beliefs. These objects were illegal. To possess one was treason, but to those who held them they were sacred, not just because they were holy, but because they were true. And truth, in a time of erasure, is the last form of resistance. Even the children, those forced into Anglican schools, baptised under pressure, stripped of their Catholic names, grew up with echoes. They remembered that their grandmother used to cross herself a different way. They remembered a Latin word whispered in a lullaby. They remembered fear, but also devotion. And while the state tried to make them forget, the bodies buried in unmarked graves remembered for them. Because Elizabeth's attempt at erasure, as thorough and violent as it was, could not control the underground faith that moved through families, across borders, through smuggled books, and inside the silence of English hearts that had never fully accepted her version of peace. And yet, despite this quiet resistance, the damage was immense. Entire generations grew up thinking Catholicism was not faith, but rebellion. Entire regions were reshaped by fear, where churches were renamed, where martyrs were mocked, where people lived their entire lives without knowing that their neighbours had once hidden priests beneath their floorboards. The state called it loyalty, but it was amnesia. And behind every forgotten name was a deliberate choice to forget. Elizabeth never apologised. She never acknowledged what had been lost. To her, these were victories, not of war, but of narrative. She had tamed a nation not only through executions, but through control of the story. And by the time she died, the story had hardened. England had always been Protestant. Elizabeth had always been right. Those who died had always deserved it. But history is not kind to lies, not forever. And as the centuries turned, and Catholicism crept back into England in hushed tones and quiet graves, the truth began to bleed through again. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but through names carved into forgotten stones, through sainthoods granted by Rome long after the scaffold had crumbled, through villages that still light candles on days the state once tried to erase, because the dead may be truant, but the story they left behind is not. And Elizabeth's greatest illusion that power can control memory was, in the end, just that, an illusion. By the final years of Elizabeth IV's reign, the rituals of terror no longer shocked. They had become routine, absorbed into the bones of the nation like lead in old water pipes, invisible but poisonous, shaping the way people thought, worshipped, moved and remembered. Not because they were forced at sword point to do so, but because the alternative had long since been buried under layers of fear, propaganda, and silent graves no one dared to visit. The Queen still stood, adorned in gold and white, draped in lace and pearls, her painted mask now a permanent part of her image, her real face hidden behind chalk and myth, her voice still firm but her eyes increasingly hollow, because beneath the grandeur of court, beneath the pageants and verses and portraits crafted to make her eternal, lay a truth that could not be ornamented, that her throne had been built on bones, stacked one by one across decades of purges, executions, and legalized silence. The number is not precise, it never could be, but scholars estimate that between 800 to 1,000 people were executed or died in prison during Elizabeth's reign for crimes related not to violence, nor theft, nor rebellion, but faith, a staggering number for a kingdom that prided itself on peace, order and civilization. And these deaths were not swift nor anonymous. They were ceremonial, deliberate, and often theatrical, public reminders that belief, if misaligned with the state, was treason by another name. Some of these victims were high profile. Priests, missionaries, women who harboured clergy in their homes. But most were not. They were farmers, servants, widows, children. They were people who refused to attend the new church, who murmured Latin prayers under their breath, who refused to spit on the memory of their saints, or who were simply in the wrong room when a priest was found. They did not die in battles. They died in basements, in prisons, on scaffolds, while crowds watched in silent dread, too afraid to flinch. And after their deaths, many were buried without names, without markers, without rites, dumped into pits, burned in fields, left behind as if they were never meant to be remembered at all, but they were there, and the nation they helped build by dying, the Protestant England that emerged from their blood, was not some accident of history. It was an engineered outcome, a carefully curated legacy, where violence was framed as stability and dissent. Even when gentle, even when whispered in grief, was treated as the seed of national collapse. The Elizabethan Golden Age that modern historians often celebrate, the age of Shakespeare, exploration, relative peace, was real, yes, but it came at a price too often unspoken, that in order to maintain the illusion of unity, the regime had to eradicate difference, to criminalise the soul, and to redefine justice so thoroughly that even mercy became indistinguishable from cruelty. England prospered, trade flourished, the arts soared. But beneath the surface of progress was a substratum of suffering, one that never made it into official records, but that lingered in the collective memory of families who had lost sons, sisters, fathers, priests, not to war, but to policy. And this policy was not a momentary panic or a brief episode of tyranny. It was a long-term strategy, a decades-long campaign in which Catholicism was not only suppressed but scapegoated, held up as the constant threat behind every foreign plot, every internal fear, every moment of doubt in Elizabeth's reign. Each execution made the next one easier, each silence made the next resistance less likely, and as the years passed, the machinery of repression became self-sustaining, requiring fewer justifications, fewer inquiries, and fewer witnesses, because by then, everyone already knew what happened to those who stepped out of line. The laws remained on the books, the priest-hunters still roamed, the hidden chapels stayed hidden. And even as Elizabeth aged, even as her once sharp mind began to bend under the weight of years, the system she built remained intact, cold, efficient, unrepentant. She died in 1603, childless, exhausted, and surrounded by shadows, not only of the men and women she had outlived, but of the nation she had created, one that both venerated and feared her, one that owed its Protestant soul to her ruthlessness, but could never quite shake the blood that stained its foundation. Her successor, James I, did not undo her work. He softened it, repackaged it, and made new enemies of his own, but he inherited a country that had already been shaped by fire, by executions, by the silence that follows a scream when no one dares to ask why. And that tendence, that normalization of repression, is perhaps the most lasting legacy of all. Because Elizabeth's true brilliance was not just in surviving, or ruling, or shaping the English identity. It was in making cruelty look necessary, in ensuring that history would record her as glorious, while quietly forgetting the cost. The people she killed for their faith, those who burned, bled, or starved under her laws, were not seen as heroes by their contemporaries. They were too dangerous for us to honour, too controversial to mourn, and yet centuries later some would be canonised by the very church Elizabeth tried to destroy. Others would be remembered in oral histories, in underground devotions, in cracked tombstones discovered centuries after the fact, hidden beneath the foundations of homes that once served as safe houses for outlawed mass. These bones, unmarked, unnamed, unnoticed, are still in the soil. They are part of the foundations of English churches, English schools, English cities. They are beneath the floors of old towers. They are in fields where crops now grow, and they are in the air of a country built on denial, on fire, on laws that claimed peace while delivering death. To walk through England today is to walk through a graveyard of forgotten martyrs, and to speak of Elizabeth's legacy without them is to speak a half-truth, to preserve the crown without counting its cost, to admire the stability without mourning those whose blood fertilized it. Because a throne built on bones does not crumble easily. It endures, it lasts, but it creaks when the wind blows just right. And if you listen, if you really listen, you might still hear them, the voices beneath the stone reminding us that every age of glory has its ghosts. In the centuries that followed Elizabeth's death, the bodies that had been burned, dismembered, silenced, and erased slowly began to re-emerge. Not in resurrection, not in revenge, but in reinterpretation, as new voices, new governments, and new generations attempted to answer the one question her reign had buried beneath layers of lore and legend. Were the people she killed saints or terrorists? Because history, for all its claims to truth, is never neutral. It is crafted, edited, instructed, shaped by those who survive, and sanctified by those who inherit the silence left behind. And under Elizabeth's reign, those who died for their faith were denied not only justice but language. They were stripped of the right to be mourned, to be named, to be framed in any context other than treason, as if the scaffold was not the end of a life, but the beginning of a lie meant to last forever. But lies, no matter how polished, eventually crack. And centuries later, long after the tower stopped echoing with screams, long after the priest holes were sealed and forgotten, long after the last generation of informants died in beds far removed from the executions they once watched, something began to shift, not in England, but in Rome. In the 20th century, the Catholic Church began a deliberate campaign of canonization, exhuming the stories of those who had been slain under Elizabeth's laws and naming them not as criminals, but as martyrs, placing halos where the crown had once placed nooses, and rewriting the final chapter of their lives with incense, liturgy, and the quiet dignity of delayed remembrance. Names like Edmund Campion, Margaret Clitheroe, Robert Southwell, and Anne Lyne. Names once blacklisted, once whispered with caution, now adorned stained glass windows, feast days, and cathedrals across the world. Not just as heroes of faith, but as witnesses to a system that demanded blood in exchange for order. To Catholics, this was justice, long overdue, but welcome. To Protestants, it was more complicated, a challenge to the accepted narrative, a reintroduction of wounds they had spent centuries covering with plaques, paintings, and royal portraits. And to modern England, it was an identity crisis, because to acknowledge that martyrs had been made during the Elizabethan era was to admit that state violence had not only occurred, but had been holy in the eyes of its victims, and that the very foundation of the English Protestant state had been fertilised with the blood of people who are now, officially, saints. This created discomfort. It raised questions. If they were saints, what does that make their executioners? If their deaths were martyrdom, what was the Queen's role in it, defender of the realm or persecutor in a crown? Some historians try to split the difference, framing the executions as necessary responses to real threats, claiming that while the methods may have been harsh, the intent was survival, not repression. But such justifications dissolve under scrutiny, because intent cannot cleanse the method, and necessary is a word that regimes use to justify the unspeakable. Others argued that it was unfair to judge Elizabeth by modern standards, that religious conflict was the norm in 16th century Europe, that her violence was simply mirroring the times. But even among her contemporaries, Elizabeth's regime was known for its surveillance, its legal manipulation, and its strategic cruelty, so much so that ambassadors from Spain, France, and the Papal States often remarked that England had become a land where prayer was treated like poison and silence was punished like sedition. So the question remains, what were they? Were the dead dangerous? Were they plotting rebellion? Were they pawns of Rome, or simply people whose loyalty to their god outlived their fear of the Queen? The answer, like all uncomfortable truths, is complex. Some were undoubtedly involved in covert missions, priests smuggled into England by seminaries abroad, intent on ministering to a population the state had outlawed. Some carried false names, false papers, codes in letters. Some believed Elizabeth was not the rightful queen, and some, in their final moments, refused to even acknowledge her authority. But many did not. Many were poor. Many were apolitical. Many were caught in webs of suspicion spun by neighbours, or betrayed by children, or arrested because they helped a traveller who happened to be wearing a cassock beneath his coat. And even those who did defy the Queen's laws did so not with daggers or plots, but with sacraments, mass, confession, prayers, baptisms. They broke the law, yes, but the law itself was designed to criminalise the sacred, to make piety indistinguishable from treason, and to force a population to choose not between good and evil, but between God and Queen. In that choice some bent, some broke, and some bled. But those who bled have begun finally to be remembered, not as perfect, not as infallible, but as human, as people who dared to live according to a truth that could not be legislated out of them. In recent decades, memorials have been erected, churches have been renamed, feast days have been established, and across England streets now carry the names of those who once died in them. Campion Way, Clitheroe Gardens, Southwell Street, quiet gestures that suggest the state, or at least the people within it, are beginning to reconsider who the victims truly were. Yet even as this reframing unfolds, it remains controversial. Some English textbooks still refer to the period as a time of religious consolidation. Some still avoid the word persecution, and many still speak of Elizabeth as a golden icon, unblemished, untouchable, the Virgin Queen who brought stability and strength to a fractured nation. Because to name the dead correctly would require naming the system that killed them. To call them saints would mean asking who crucified them, and to do that would mean touching the myth at the centre of England's national identity, a myth that Elizabeth, brilliant and brutal, spent her entire life crafting. So we are left with two histories, one of crowns and progress, of naval victories and literary triumphs, of an England that rose from chaos to become a power, and another of bones, of prayers cut short, of voices silenced beneath the weight of law, of mothers who watch their sons disappear into towers and never return. Both are true, both are England, but only one has been allowed to speak, until now. There is something deeply unsettling about the image of a monarch alone in her chamber at twilight, seated beneath a gilded canopy, dressed in embroidered silk that catches the dying light like flame, while the weight of 100 unsigned names lingers in the shadows just beyond the edge of the candle. Because for all the power Elizabeth I wielded, for all the portraits that painted her eternal, the reality of her rule, when stripped of ceremony and poetry, was far more human, far more fragile, and far more blood-stained than her myth would ever allow. She died in 1603 after 44 years on the throne, without a husband, without a child, without an heir of her own blood, and despite the glory assigned to her in textbooks and triumphal engravings, she left behind a nation still splintered by faith, still afraid of the silence that followed a knock on the door, still governed by laws that defined belief as crime and memory as sedition. Her body was laid in Westminster Abbey, beneath a marble effigy that shows her asleep, lips closed, hands folded, as if in peace. But peace is a narrative written by the living, and the silence that followed her death was not relief, but exhaustion, the kind that comes when a country realizes it has spent decades surviving rather than flourishing. No one ever tried her. No one ever indicted Thomas. No tribunal was held to weigh the executions against the victories, to ask whether the Elizabethan Golden Age was lit by brilliance or by burning flesh. And so her legacy was sealed not by judgment, but by forgetting. History remembered the poet queen, the warrior of Tilbury, the virgin bride of England. It remembered the flourishing of theatre, the defeat of the Armada, the rise of empire. But it did not remember the corpses beneath her crown. It did not remember the names of the children who watched their parents hanged. It did not remember the women crushed beneath stones. It did not remember the bones hidden in church walls, the Latin prayers whispered into rags before a blade fell, the priests who died not in rebellion but in benediction. Because history, as written by the victors, has little use for ambiguity. It prefers saints or tyrants, gods or demons, crowns or traitors, but Elizabeth was none of these. Or rather, she was all of them. She was a woman forged in fire, a child of beheading and betrayal, raised in fear, crowned in the shadow of execution, and taught by every moment of her life that power, once taken, must never be given back. And in that crucible she built herself into something greater than human, a symbol, a sovereign, a myth. But in building herself that way, she became something else too, a mirror of the very cruelty she once feared. And it is that contradiction, that terrible, inescapable tension between the golden mask and the blood beneath it, that defines her true legacy. Because the truth is, Elizabeth I was not a monster. She was a ruler, and ruling in her time meant choosing who would live and who would die, not as an act of vengeance, but as an equation of survival. She believed that a single Catholic mass could unravel a kingdom. She believed that tolerating dissent was courting assassination. She believed that to keep the peace she had to make fear louder than faith, and so she did. But now, centuries later, when the fire has gone out and the ashes have cooled, we must ask a different question. Not whether she was great, not whether she was wise, not even whether she was right, but whether her greatness was worth the silence it required, whether the peace she delivered justifies the terror she unleashed, whether the crown she wore was truly hers, or if it was built piece by piece from the corpses of those who were never given the chance to speak. We walk through museums now and see her face on coins, her gowns under glass, her signature on yellowed parchment, and we call it history. But history does not exist in glass. It exists in the things we refuse to say, in the names we erase, in the prayers we dismiss, in the blood we wash clean in retrospect. And so the question remains, can a legacy be called glorious if it stands on a foundation of grief? Can we revere the flame and ignore what it burned? Can we admire the crown without asking what it crushed? Perhaps the answer is not to destroy the myth. Perhaps the answer is to let it breathe, but not alone. To remember Elizabeth not just as a queen, but as a woman who ruled with fear, because fear was all she had ever known. And to remember those who died not as faceless victims, but as lives interrupted, each with their own hopes, their own families, their own version of England that didn't require killing to survive. Because until we name the cost of power, we cannot understand it. Until we speak for the silenced, we remain complicit in the silence. And until we admit that even golden crowns can be heavy with bone dust, we will keep repeating the same stories, worshipping the same images, and forgetting the same dead. So here at the end, let us name the truth. That the Virgin Queen was not stainless, that her throne was not bloodless, that glory when built upon fear is a glory that trembles beneath the weight of its own ghosts, and that if history has one duty, it is not to celebrate power, it is to remember what it cost.